Hey, Safer here. My disdain for Woodrow Wilson is legendary. Something I keep having to remind folks is that he was a historian, and therefore I get to sit in judgment of him, because that's peer review. Well, he wasn't the only historian president of the United States. Someone else did it before him, so it's time to talk about Theodore Roosevelt, who preferred to go by his military title of Colonel and found Teddy to be a childish nickname and often simply went by TR. I will be using those terms interchangeably. Yes, he was a historian and a prolific writer, as you can see from my bibliography below, which only has a few of his books. He certainly shaped the American history field, becoming one of the three important figures for solidifying the frontier myth as the basis for American exceptionalism. In the name of Buffalo Bill, Teddy Roosevelt, and Frederick Jackson Turner. Much like Wilson, TR was a part of a historiographic shift that had major ramifications. He actually makes for an interesting contrasting image. Just a quick note while I'm editing, I tried to record this like I had with the Wilson videos, as in with a webcam on a monitor, but neglected to stare directly at the camera. I've become too used to using a teleprompter. It's a bit annoying, so my apologies on that. Wilson was a taciturn and lanky academic with little experience in politics before becoming president. Teddy was a boisterous amateur who'd spent most of his career in politics. They both were progressives, historians, and imperialists who won the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm somewhat ambivalent about the Colonel. He was a boyhood hero of mine, but his more unseemly attributes certainly eroded that mental image. Something about his boisterous charm made me forgive his faults, though. He was certainly an imperialist, white supremacist, warmonger, and nationalist, but he also seemed to have learned from his mistakes, unlike Wilson, whom Roosevelt fervently despised, which is a good mark in my book. Wilson! TR was a strong reformer, jack of all trades, veteran, and just a fun dude. Get it? Because he was a dude rancher? Well, anyways, Roosevelt's legacy is nowhere close to as harmful as Wilson's, yet he did indeed leave a significant imprint on America today. So let's finally dive into good old Teddy's story, because it is really incredible. The Roosevelt family was incredibly wealthy, full of New York bankers, socialites, and merchants. Teddy's father, Theodore Sr., was a significant philanthropist who helped found the Met and the American Museum of Natural History. To his son's everlasting sorrow, he chose to fundraise for the Union during the Civil War rather than fight. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born 3 years before the war, and Sr. sent his children on a grand tour around the Mediterranean with significant tutelage in the classics. He had a famously good memory, who readily recited numerous works of literature and philosophy, learned several languages, and could recall conversations and quotations with precision decades after the fact. Teddy had quite the cosmopolitan upbringing, which would inform his later nationalism. Jr. was an asthmatic boy at a time where there was no medication for the condition. With his father's stern encouragement, Jr. essentially got over it by becoming an outdoorsman and constantly exercising. He gained an enduring love of hunting, hiking, and boxing. With such a privileged childhood, Teddy was destined to go places in America, but the rich actually disdained politics at the time. Instead, he focused on more general pursuits in the arts for his bachelor's degree from Harvard, graduating with honors. Before that, his father died during a particularly nasty foray into New York politics, which devastated Jr. Nonetheless, he started writing a history of the Navy during the War of 1812 and published the 2-volume work in 1882. At this point, history was mostly written by amateurs like TR, but he would take part in the professionalization of the field despite not earning a graduate degree. Along with scholarly interests, he corresponded with numerous famous personalities throughout the world, making friends everywhere with his undeniable charisma and charm. Before he could write much more history, he decided to go into politics as a Republican, since that was the party of business that his family so believed in, becoming a New York State Assemblyman the same year as his first book. He was quickly recognized for being a firebrand who used his elite position to appeal to ordinary people who felt disenfranchised by rampant corruption. During the presidential election of 1884, he opposed the nomination of James Blaine for his machine politics, but came back to supporting Blaine purely out of party loyalty, but he continued to gain a reputation as a prominent New York reformer. Before this, Roosevelt's first marriage ended in tragedy. His daughter was born in February of 1884, but his wife, Alice Lee, died 2 days later due to complications of childbirth. Only a few hours prior to that, his mother died too. TR was so devastated and childish in his sorrow that he abjured his daughter and the mansion that carried his wife's name, originally named Lee Home. Instead, he left New York altogether to ranch in what would become North Dakota. He'd run the Elkhorn Ranch, going on many adventures, at least until a terrible blizzard devastated the herd before the spring of 1887. As he was leaving that venture, he entered a second marriage, returned to New York, brought back his daughter Alice, and renamed the mansion Sycamore Hill. During his time ranching, he continued to publish books. Some were simply his own adventure stories, but he continued to work on history. 2 were biographies of Thomas Hart Benton and Gouverneur Morris. TR needed a good income because of his growing family. In 1889, he released the first of 4 volumes on the winning of the West. This was his most important contribution to historiography, which he argued the West belonged to the Americans by right of conquest and of armed possession. It was held by rifle-bearing backwoods farmers, hard and tenacious men, who never lightly yielded what once they had grasped. This was his key contribution to the frontier myth, a triumphal narrative of Anglo-Saxon conquest going westward from the Atlantic towards the Pacific to become the United States, civilizing savage lands with their manly might. Yes, that was absolutely white supremacist, and TR was one. He couldn't stop talking about the difference between races, and that informed his politics. The frontier myth is predicated on white supremacy, as is American exceptionalism, which proclaims that the winning of the West created a singularly great nation, free and powerful beyond all else. In 1890, Roosevelt's friend, Alfred Thayer Mahan, argued how the United States could control naval power through commerce protection, which set off a worldwide battleship arms race, which I talked about in this episode. A few years later, Frederick Jackson Turner took what TR had done with the frontier myth and completed it by arguing that the meeting of savagery and civilization had forged America anew, defining the national character. This frontier thesis was presented at a meeting of a new organization called the American Historical Association, which Teddy was a member of. The AHA is still the preeminent professional organization for American history today, and Teddy was of course part of legitimizing it. But he did not stay focused on historian work for long. He'd run a hopeless campaign for New York mayor in 1886. In 1888, Roosevelt stumped for Benjamin Harrison's campaign, re-ingratiating himself in the Republican Party, making friends with fellow reformer Henry Cabot Lodge. Since Roosevelt constantly campaigned against the spoils system, getting a government job was a bit of an issue, but he needed one. Lodge got Harrison to appoint him as a civil service commissioner for a year, and then returned to New York as police commissioner, where he reformed the NYPD as much as possible, becoming known for his giant smile he'd flash in the dark before reprimanding officers for their misbehavior. Accounts vary on the effectiveness of his crusade. In 1897, after having fought against the Free Silver campaign of William Jennings Bryan, President McKinley appointed Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he would orchestrate a modernization campaign in accordance with Mahan's arms race, partially because of Roosevelt's advice to intimidate Spaniards in hopes that they would make way for Cuban rebels. McKinley sent ships there. One of them, the USS Maine, blew up in Havana Harbor. The newspapers hyped up the incident, and Teddy did his part to blame Spain. Congress declared war, and Teddy saw opportunity to join in. He put together a volunteer cavalry unit made up of Westerners and jocks, placing Leonard Wood as the unit's commander just above himself. He made some silly mistakes at first, like fraternizing with the men under him, but they trained up together and were considered a formidable unit, hence their sobriquet, Rough Riders. Upon reaching Cuba, they saw much combat, losing nearly 40% of the unit to bullets and disease, the highest casualty rate of any regiment during that war. When Wood got promoted to fill another position, TR became the commander of the Rough Riders. He boasted of having shot a Spaniard himself and leading a famous charge, garnering much praise from newspapers. The recently minted colonel used this prestige to win the gubernatorial election of New York, though only barely defeating his Democratic opponent with only a 1% margin at the polls. Much of the public recognized that he only ran on his fame and talked about foreign policy that he'd have no effect on as governor. He openly supported taking more land from Spain and would insist on keeping an iron grip on the Philippines, even while the United States committed horrific atrocities to do so. After all, he believed in the white man's burden to civilize them. In a speech, he said, "Men who preeminently and distinctly embody all that is most American in the American character I wish to preach, not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." In the West Indies and the Philippines alike, we are confronted by most difficult problems. It is cowardly to shrink from solving them in the proper way. For solved they must be, if not by us, then by some stronger and more manful race. If we are too weak, too selfish, or too foolish to solve them, some bolder and abler people must undertake the solution. The white supremacist frontier myth he helped forge had massive policy implications, but he could only do nothing but talk. Instead, he started several progressive reforms in New York, such as regular press meetings, a corporate tax, and antagonizing party bosses. But that did not last long, because in 1900, the Republican Party contrived a means of shutting him up for a while. They relegated him to the vice presidency. That plan backfired when an assassin shot McKinley dead only a few months into his second term, making Roosevelt president.
What's up, bitches?
He had many reforms in mind, declaring he would enact a square deal for every man, big or small, rich or poor. He later explained, "When I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play." I'm Teddy Roosevelt, What is that voice? When I say that I am for a square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service. This means that our government, national and state, must be freed from the sinister influence of control of special interests. Property shall be the servant and not the master of the Commonwealth. Who insists that the creature of man's making shall be the servant and not the master of the man who made it. The citizens of the United States must effectively control the mighty commercial forces which they have called into being. Bully! There were three primary goals of his square deal, all with C's for their initials: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. When he was up for re-election in 1904, he easily won in a landslide because of his progressive policy. As soon as he became president on September 14, 1901, he quickly set about enacting the square deal. The centerpiece of Roosevelt's efforts was him deciding which national corporations were good or bad. He used the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act to launch lawsuits against the bad ones and destroy their uncompetitive monopolies. The first of these was against the Northern Securities Company, a recently formed railroad holding corporation, and the administration started that lawsuit only a few months after Teddy's inauguration, and it would be the first of many. He'd passed much legislation for consumer protections. The Elkins Act heavily regulated railroads and punished discriminatory pricing. Then the Hepburn Act expanded the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission to govern such industries. After much controversy about the meatpacking industry, he got the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Acts passed, which is the origin of the FDA and why we can depend on our food's edibility. Congress halted a few of his other efforts to broaden these regulatory powers, such as an enhanced antitrust act and insurance regulation. Instead, TR created the Department of Commerce and Labor to supervise national businesses, which included the Bureau of Corporations, the predecessor to the FTC. The BOC sought cooperation between firms and voluntarily regulated themselves. Finally came conservation of the environment. During his time as president, Roosevelt began the U.S. Forestry Service, a more distinct and powerful environmentalist force than several decades of capitalist reservations prior. He made Yosemite the first national park of many to come, created historic preservation projects, and the reclamation of waterworks. He had a lot of friends like John Muir who encouraged what he called conservatism, but we differentiate as conservationism. There were two really mixed legacies from his fair deal politics. Given his trying to distinguish between good and bad national trusts, he had to maintain a balanced approach with labor. For the first time in U.S. history, a sitting president actively intervened in labor disputes. Sometimes he arbitrated in a union's favor, sometimes not. It almost entirely depended on what he felt was the moral outcome that maintained wealth while giving a better quality of life for workers. His moralism grated many, especially when all his pro-worker sentiment didn't always go in labor's favor. But at least he personally interjected to resolve such disputes, which would not become normal for presidents until his distant relation took office in 1933. All other presidents had only tried to keep the peace, which inherently favored the already powerful capitalists. The second thing he was very mixed on was his racial legacy. Remember, TR was a white supremacist, perhaps not as virulent and hateful as his contemporaries, but still an inherently prejudicial perspective. While he was the first president to officially dine with a black man in the White House, that man was Booker T. Washington, who mostly played to the respectability politics that appealed to Roosevelt's whole strenuous masculinity. The colonel did speak out against lynching, something that was scandalous and harmed him politically, but he did nothing to mitigate the rise of Jim Crow throughout his time in power, something he could easily have done by assigning U.S. Marshals to investigate the murders. Obviously, he was significantly less racist than somebody like Woodrow Wilson, who was a lost causer, and yes, Wilson was abnormally racist compared to his contemporaries, including Roosevelt. But TR still failed a crucial test of his tolerance. A group of Buffalo soldiers were blamed for shooting into Brownsville, Texas, and killing civilians. The proof was circumstantial at best, but Roosevelt put his foot down and dishonorably discharged them anyways. An objectively terrible decision, especially given some of those very same men charged up San Juan Hill alongside him only a few years prior. The Fair Deal was a huge shift in domestic politics towards progressivism, arguably the most progressive of any president until the New Deal, which took inspiration from its namesake. But Teddy's foreign policy was equally substantial. He had learned much from his days campaigning for suppressing the Philippine insurrection. The worst of it was basically complete once he took office, though stuff like the Moro War and various minor recurrences continued until well after his presidency. Instead of vigorous imperialism like he wanted before, he was somewhat humbled. And by humbled, I mean he built up the Navy and sent it around the world to show off.
Oh, here comes the Great White Fleet. Totally nothing imperialistic about that.
Yeah, well, it's better than straight-up campaigning for genocide like he had back in 1899, I guess? One of the strangest things about his foreign policy was how much he wielded what he called the big stick, while somehow speaking softly. The technical term for this policy of speaking softly and carrying a big stick is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but often simplified to gunboat diplomacy. The basic idea is that the threat of U.S. naval intervention should deter Latin American countries from making decisions that are harmful to American interests. For the most part, TR didn't have to act out that threat and reaped huge benefits from it. But eventually, an ultimatum must be followed upon. As such, the colonel intervened in a number of countries militarily, though none of these lasted for more than a year. You can argue about whether this result was because of his effectiveness or simply being in a lucky circumstance of never having to deal with something as catastrophic as a European war. But the sheer number of times he managed to take a tiny intervention and somehow conclude it without serious attempts at annexation or prolonged occupation is kind of amazing. The most important consequence of his gunboat diplomacy was the creation of Panama. For decades, Americans had sought a canal across the isthmus, but Nicaragua was politically fraught, and what would become Panama was terrible in terms of elevation. Locals there sought separation from Colombia, and when Roosevelt parked a fleet offshore, that guaranteed their independence. Of course, for the US Navy's trouble, the United States secured a lease of land for creating the canal. Its construction was brutal, killing a monumental 25,000 workers, but it would be completed in 1914, a decade after starting during TR's presidency. In 1906, he even became the first president to travel outside of US borders while in office by going down there to see the diggings. His prodigious enforcement of gunboat diplomacy led directly to two significant peaceable outcomes. In 1902, President of Venezuela, Cipriano Castro, refused to pay his foreign debts, and several European countries blockaded Venezuela, which was dependent on trade. TR maintained this wasn't a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and instead pushed for debt repayment while threatening any European empire suggesting an invasion. He later claimed to have averted a German attack, but this is dubious at best. Either way, the blockade ended a year later with Castro paying his debts. Though this was only a halfway showing of gunboat diplomacy, it energized interests in Roosevelt's negotiative power, which came in handy only a few years later. Russia was pretty obviously losing a war with Japan in 1905, so TR offered to arbitrate. Despite being obviously inclined towards the Russians, he still found them racially inferior too. Nonetheless, Japan had clearly won the war, so over the course of a month, Teddy negotiated a series of land cessions in Japan's favor, ending a seriously bloody war. The Treaty of Portsmouth was a clear violation of the United States' previous treaty with Korea, but it was really just a decision between Japan or Russia. For ending this war, Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize. So with all of that, he seemed poised to win a third term, but in the American tradition of only serving twice in the presidency, he had forsworn another run in 1904. Instead, he tapped William Howard Taft, who won the 1908 campaign with ease, given TR's endorsement. Confident in Taft's ability to follow his legacy, Teddy set off on several adventures. He went on an African safari, bagging so many pelts that he might as well be considered a one-man extinction event. This wasn't considered contradictory to his conservationism at the time, because he was conserving the pelts. After that, he toured Europe again, making friends with several key officials, including some monarchs. In 1910, he returned to a hero's welcome, one soured by his ever-present egotism. Taft had supported a raised tariff to protect Northeast industry and fired Roosevelt's chief of the Forestry Service. Taft had also been less aggressive with the Navy. These were fairly insignificant problems, but the public stirred up vitriol against Taft, just as any president, and TR fell completely for that. In mid-1910, he called for a new nationalism centered around welfare and property rights. For the next couple years, he campaigned for that and was clearly positioning himself to take Taft's place on the Republican ticket. By the 1912 election, 12 states had enacted primaries, and Roosevelt clearly won those. But Taft, through some savvy maneuvering at the party convention that year, received the nomination anyways. This was the machine politics Teddy railed against so much, and he was determined to defeat Taft, forming a new party to challenge his chosen successor. This was the Progressive Party, and it was founded on the welfare principle of Roosevelt's new nationalism. Their platform, called A Contract with the People, wanted all kinds of new programs, such as a precursor to Social Security, workers' comp, farm relief subsidies, an 8-hour work week, and so many more. Most radical of all was his support of women's suffrage, which brought many activists to his side, including Jane Addams. In the midst of the campaign, a madman shot TR in the chest. Lucky for him, his spectacles and speech mostly stopped the bullet, which permanently lodged in his ribcage. Refusing to be put down, he started the speech saying, "I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. but fortunately I had my manuscript, so you see I was going to make a long speech, and there is a bullet. There is where the bullet went through, and it probably saved me from it going into my heart. The bullet is in me now, so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best. He continued, hence why the Progressive Party came to be known as the Bull Moose Party. Nonetheless, the Colonel's egotism split the vote, virtually handing the presidency to the Democrats, and therefore Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 election.
Wilson!
TR's hubris had guaranteed a worse outcome for the nation he loves so much. Instead, he went on a dangerous expedition deep into the Amazon, trying to follow the River of Doubt. He barely survived that adventure and put his son at risk in the process. When he got back to the United States, he tried to stump for the Progressive Party, but they didn't do very well. By the end of that, World War I was in full swing. TR was regularly writing opinion pieces for various newspapers, constantly harping on Wilson for being inadequate to meet the occasion. Ever since 1905, Roosevelt had promoted the old Kantian idea of a League of Nations. Now that the Great War was in full swing, he started pushing for a league to enforce peace, mending the rift with Taft and Henry Cabot Lodge in the process. Yeah, the League of Nations was not Wilson's idea whatsoever, and he kinda screwed it up. When German U-boats sank the Lusitania, Teddy pushed Wilson to act with greater punishment, but couldn't do much. "What a dreadful creature Wilson is," Teddy complained. "I cannot believe our people have grown so yellow as to stand for him." The Colonel tried to get the Republican nomination again in 1916, but also failed. Quickly after that election, the Zimmerman telegram came through and the US joined the Great War. TR wanted to form his own company of volunteers like during the Spanish War, but Wilson would hear none of it, basically ignoring TR altogether. Instead, Teddy's children went to war, one of which died as a pilot. This seems to have broken him, and Theodore Roosevelt died in early 1919, just after the war was over. Well, that was a hell of a life, wasn't it? TR began as a rich cosmopolitan, so privileged, yet overcoming hardship at every turn. He became a historian and propagated the frontier myth. Despite being a white supremacist and part of the landed gentry, he actively sought to better himself and the nation. His time as a rancher, petty reformer, and soldier influenced his presidency. Once there on a fluke, he made the best of it, instituting the square deal as best he could, though not without issues. He used gunboat diplomacy as opposed to his old hardline imperialism, not that that was much consolation for foreign countries he projected dominion over. But his egoism got the best of him, allowing Wilson to win the presidency in 1912, ruining whatever progress Roosevelt attempted. Instead, it would take another Roosevelt from the next generation to bring back the progressive era during one of the worst economic circumstances in American history. TR left an indelible mark, but it was not as enduring as Wilson's would be. He's a fascinating president, historian, and character.